Welcome back, everyone. It is my pleasure now to introduce Index Pharmaceuticals, where we have the CEO, Peter Seruni, with us.
Thanks, Dan. My name is Peter Seruni. I'm the CEO of Index Pharmaceuticals. And here's our standard forward-looking statement. Index Pharmaceuticals is a biotech company developing a first-in-class medication for patients with ulcerative colitis, like Felicia here, in order for Felicia and her fellow patients to get relief from the debilitating disease that ulcerative colitis is. So our lead asset is called cobitolimod, and we're now advancing that into phase 3 in moderate to severe left-sided ulcerative colitis. And apart from cobitolimod, we have a broad portfolio of preclinical assets from the same platform, the DIMS platform, where DIMS stands for DNA-based immunomodulatory sequences. So all of these are little pieces of DNA, oligonucleotides, that we can use to modulate the immune system via toll-like receptor 9. And as such, they have a potentially broad application in inflammatory diseases. We are listed on the First North here in Stockholm since 2016. And in the beginning of the year, we raised approximately $63 million, 533 million Swedish, in an oversubscribed rights issue. And that money will be spent on phase 3 development of cobitolimod. Our current market cap is about $95 million. And at the end of the second quarter, we had $56 million or 480 million Swedish in the bank. Following the rights issue, our main shareholders are Link, that's the investment vehicle of Bengt Jolander. They have 13%. We have the Swiss Life Science Fund, HPM, with about 10%. We have the Fourth National Pension Fund with 10%. And we have Handelsbanken funds with about 5%. Together, they have about 40% of the company. So we really strengthened the shareholder base in the rights issue there. So ulcerative colitis then, it's a inflammatory bowel disease, which is caused by chronic inflammation of the colon that leads to ulcers in the colonic mucosa. And it comes in flares, and in between the flares you can have periods of remission. But when you're in a flare, an active period, the patient suffers from the typical symptoms of very frequent blood and mucus mixed diarrhea. You also have abdominal pain, you can have extraintestinal manifestations. All of this contributes to a significant negative impact on the quality of life of these patients. The current therapies for moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, the more difficult cases, help a limited share of the patients, and they are associated with severe side effects. And regarding the quality of life, we have a quote here from our annual report where we interviewed Felicia, so a 23-year-old girl, and she points to the uncertainty of knowing when the next flare will hit you as one of the most concerning issues with the disease for her. So, moderate to severe ulcerative colitis is a high-value market already. There are a number of treatments available. We have the old anti-inflammatory drugs, the aminosalicylates in the first line, and quite a large share of patients need help from steroids to get out of a flare. But of course, you don't want to stay on steroids for a longer period of time. So these are really to get people into remission out of a flare. But still, a large share of patients need more. And that's where we get to the third line, which is really where most of the market value in this indication is. And it's also where most of the development is taking place. Where today we have a number of different classes approved, and it's also here that we intend to position cobitolimod. The biggest selling drugs are the biologics that sell for more than 5 billion per year in this indication alone. You have about 200,000 patients on those drugs, and they're quite expensive, $30,000 to $80,000 in the US and around 10,000 euros in Europe. But as I mentioned earlier, these third-line therapies do have problems with severe side effects, and also quite a large share of patients actually stop responding to the drugs after an initial response. If you can control the disease with pharmaceuticals, colectomy is the end station for these patients, where you surgically remove the whole colon, and the patient is left with a stoma bag, and eventually you can create sort of pouch by the end of the small intestines. So there's really a need for new treatments here, and this is where we come in with cobitolimod as a first-in-class treatment with a high market potential. So we're focusing on moderate to severe ulcerative colitis patients, and actually those with left-sided ulcerative colitis, meaning that it's the last part, or the part closest to the rectum, which is inflamed. And we had positive results from a phase 2b study 2 years ago, where we showed not only good efficacy, but also an excellent safety profile. And that complements data from 4 previous clinical studies that support the efficacy and safety that we demonstrated in phase 2b. And based on this data, we are now advancing into phase 3. And what we see we have to offer is really a competitive efficacy in combination with a superior safety profile. This is a local treatment. We give it by enema, and you have a picture of the bottle there, rectally, every 3rd week, so it's very infrequent. And this local treatment means that the drug is not floating around anywhere else in the body and causing off-target effects. So it's really a targeted topical local treatment, which probably explains part of the excellent safety profile. We have a novel mechanism of action, a toll-like receptor 9 agonist, and the good safety profile lends and the unique mechanism of action makes this a good candidate for combination therapy, where there's more and more talk and ideas of combining several drugs to break through the inflammation in ulcerative colitis, and then you want at least one of them to be safe. So all in all, we see that cobitolimod has blockbuster potential given this outstanding combination of efficacy and safety and a novel and unique mechanism of action. So what cobitolimod does is that it activates toll-like receptor 9, or TLR9, by mimicking microbial DNA, which inhibits inflammation and leads to healing of the intestinal mucosa in ulcerative colitis. Toll-like receptor 9, or TLR9, plays an important role in the immune system, and as such is an attractive target for modulating the immune system in several different immunological diseases, including inflammatory bowel disease. But we have several more DIMS compounds, as I said, that are also TLR9 agonists that we are testing in models of other inflammatory diseases outside of IBD. So cobitolimod is also really will also serve as a proof of concept for the whole platform here. So our phase 2b results were published in the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, which is one of the highest ranked journals in this therapeutic field. And it was also presented at the main gastro conferences, both in the US and in Europe. And we have a picture here of the principal investigator, Professor Raja Atreya. If we look at the market then, cobitolimod addresses a potential market of more than $9 billion. So there are about a bit more than 2 million patients in the major 7 pharmaceutical markets that have ulcerative colitis. About 60% of those have moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, a more difficult form. And of these, a bit more than half have left-sided disease, meaning that the disease is limited to the last part of the colon, closest to the rectum, the descending part. And of these, in turn, a bit more than half fail conventional therapy, like the pyramid we looked at previously. That leaves us with 400,000 patients, and at an assumed pricing of $35,000 per year in the US and $11,000 per year in Europe and Japan, that translates into a theoretical or potential addressable market of more than $9 billion. Of course, not all patients will actually end up on cobitolimod of these, but it illustrates a large commercial potential, and we estimate that peak sales at the successful commercialization would exceed $1 billion a year. This market has attracted quite a bit of development. Here we try to illustrate in the upper panel the currently approved products, and in the lower panel we have the late-stage pipeline, meaning compounds that have reported phase 3 results or are currently in phase 3. If we start at the upper panel, we have a couple of different classes approved. We have the TNF-alpha inhibitors, we have integrin inhibitors, we have JAK inhibitors, IL-23 inhibitors, and one S1P receptor modulator, which was recently approved. And the blue bars show the share of patients that go into remission, become symptom-free, based on a short course of this treatment. And the orange bars shows the corresponding share of patients in their placebo arms. And on the far right, you have our phase 2b data for cobitolimod as the first-in-class TLR9 agonist. Interestingly enough, almost everything that is currently approved help about the same share of patients, 16 to 18%, which means more than 80% of patients do not go into remission based on an induction course of any of these treatments. The placebo response has varied a bit, but in general, you can say that the difference between the active and placebo is somewhere around 10 to 15%. And our phase 2b data compares very favorably with those currently approved drugs. In the lower panel, we have the late-stage pipeline, where there are several JAK inhibitors waiting to hear from the regulatory authorities. And very interestingly, FDA yesterday communicated the outcome of a big safety review of this class for chronic treatment, and they will have additions to their labels in the US with more safety concerns than they currently have on their black box warnings. We also have another S1P receptor modulator from Arena Pharmaceuticals, and we have an IL-23 inhibitor from Lilly. And again, cobitolimod compares favorably. The one with the best efficacy here, upadacitinib or Rinvoq from AbbVie, is part of this safety review, which brings us from FDA, which brings us to the other side of the coin, which is safety, where all of the currently approved and late-stage compounds belong to classes with known safety issues. So the TNF-alpha inhibitors have been around for a long time. We know they have a black box warning, infections, malignancy, skin disorders. Integrin inhibitors are better, but still infections and hypersensitivity are issues with those. And then we get to the JAK inhibitors that already before yesterday had a black box warning for infections, cancer, etc., and pulmonary embolism, and now they have to add severe cardiac events and death. IL-23 inhibitors, infections and malignancies, and also S1P receptor modulators have infections, but also cardiac effects. And this is because all of these are immunosuppressants, systemic immunosuppressants. And of course, if you push down the immune system, you can get rid of the inflammation, but you also get other issues. We're now advancing cobitolimod into phase 3. We had successful scientific advice with both FDA and EMA ahead of designing the study or the program, and both of them endorsed that we now advance cobitolimod into phase 3 based on our previous studies. We have a very strong support from key opinion leaders. We've set up a North American and a European advisory board. And we've conducted quite a bit of primary market research that supports the commercial potential of cobitolimod, where, again, the efficacy to safety ratio is considered unsurpassable by gastroenterologists. And unsurpassable is a word from, or this phrasing comes from the consultancy that conducted this market research for us. It's not our own idea. And the doctors are very likely to prescribe cobitolimod to a significant proportion of their patients, and importantly, before turning to anti-TNF-alpha therapies. And payers confirm that we can price in line with recently launched third-line ulcerative colitis therapies, which means a high price. So we have communicated the phase 3 design for the whole phase 3 program, where the first step is an induction study, meaning a short study in patients with moderate to severe left-sided ulcerative colitis that have failed conventional treatment and or biologics or JAK inhibitors, so a targeted modern therapy. So we're looking to include 440 patients with active disease. They will be randomized initially to 3 different dose arms, 250 milligrams, 500 milligrams, or placebo, given twice over a 3-week period. So once at the start of the study and once again after 3 weeks. And then the primary endpoint is the share of patients that go into remission at the end of 6 weeks. After about a third of the study, we will do a blinded interim analysis to select which dose of 250 or 500 milligrams is the best one. And the rest of the patients will then be randomized to either that winning dose or the best dose or placebo. And that's where the comparison will, the statistical comparison will be done in the end. Patients that respond to the treatment will be offered to continue in a 1-year maintenance study where they will continue to get treated every 3rd week with cobitolimod. And the aim is, of course, to maintain as many as possible in remission. Once this first study has been completed, the first induction study, we will read out the data and then we will start a second induction study in a sequential manner, and we will be able to learn from the first induction study for the second induction study. And the money we raised will be enough to get us through the first induction study and the associated part of the maintenance study. The study design is based on the successful phase 2b study. With this additional higher dose of 500 milligrams, which is actually higher than we've tested in the phase 2b, there is a chance that we can increase the efficacy further. It's a global study. It will include a few hundred sites in over 30 countries, and we have assigned the study to Pareto as CRO, which is a leading global CRO. And we recently received the first regulatory approval to start. It came from the Swedish MPA, and last week we could also communicate that the FDA has approved the initiation of the study, and the approval process is ongoing in other countries. So we are now ready to initiate patient recruitment after the summer when the clinics are back from vacation, and we see this will be possible now that the pressure from the COVID pandemic is starting to release a bit following the vaccinations. And then we expect it will take 18 to 24 months to complete the first induction study from initiation. And regarding the patient recruitment, we had a very successful model in our previous study where Index was very active directly towards the sites in collaboration with the CRO, which was also Parexel in that case. And in order to be able to sustain that model, we have now strengthened the clinical development team. So we announced 2 new hires last week as well to beef up the organization to be able to take a very active part in this study and not leave it to the CRO. And as I said, the financing of this study is covered by the money we raised in the oversubscribed rights issue earlier this year. So that phase 3 program is directed towards moderate to severe left-sided ulcerative colitis, but we also see that cobitolimod could definitely have an effect also in more extensive disease, so all moderate to severe UC, in milder patients, given the safety profile. Others competing products cannot necessarily move down to milder patients, but with our safety profile we could. We have other inflammatory bowel disease conditions like proctitis or Crohn's disease, pouchitis, And we see moderate to severe left-sided ulcerative colitis as a stepping stone to then expand the application of cobitolimod to other indications, which would also then expand the potential market. So in summary, the investment opportunity, there is major suffering and costs associated with ulcerative colitis. Cobitolimod has significant commercial potential, blockbuster potential, given the high unmet medical need for new treatments in this indication. We have an addressable market of more than $9 billion. And given this outstanding combination of efficacy and safety and a novel mechanism of action, we see there is blockbuster potential here. We're now moving into phase 3. Patient recruitment will be initiated after the summer, and the financing is secured until the next readout of pivotal data. So with that, I thank you, and we can move to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this interesting presentation of Index Pharma and the progress you're making. You alluded to actually briefly in the presentation to the news yesterday, and it's I think it has been coming from many other molecule classes and target classes in the past, but now more so with the JAK inhibitors. Could you maybe explain a bit what you think this implies for you, and also even moving out of the JAK inhibitors, what we've seen also from others, even etrasimod, which also has cardiac side effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yesterday FDA announced the outcome of a large safety review of JAK inhibitors as a class, mainly based on data from Xeljanz, which is the currently only approved JAK inhibitor in ulcerative colitis. It's a Pfizer product. And their conclusion was that this class can or does increase the risk for severe cardiac effects, cancer, and death. So the FDA will update their already black box warnings with these additional warnings, and they added that you should only use a JAK inhibitor in TNF-alpha failures. So they firmly position JAK inhibitors as a last line option within this indication. And that's of course bad news for patients, but actually for Index it's good news, because we really stand out on the safety side and are already aiming for a positioning before the JAK inhibitors, and now if the before the TNF-alphas, and if now JAK inhibitors are behind TNF-alphas on the label already, that can make our life easier as an earlier line option based on the safety. So there's been quite a bit of development in the competitive landscape over the last year. We've had some spectacular failures, but we also see some compounds coming from behind. So it's an interesting field that we're following, but we still feel that we stand out on the safety side. And apart from the JAK inhibitors, there has not been much improvement or any improvement on the efficacy side. So JAK inhibitors looks to be the most efficacious class, but with the safety issues they have, it will be difficult for them to really get full credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think patients are looking for something that is not introducing a new severe problem. That's, I think, indeed a good differentiating factor. If one other question is if Index chooses to go to the market by itself, what are the costs associated with such a plan?
Yeah, so we haven't really communicated that, so I can't be too specific. But we raised about 500 million Swedish for this first part of the phase 3 program. And then there is a second part of the phase 3 program that we can speculate will be of about the same size. So that would require additional funding but nota bene after we've read out the results of the first induction study. And then, of course, there are the commercialization costs, and I'm sure we can get back to that in later discussions. But at the moment, we haven't communicated any estimates for that. But there are also benchmarks that you could look at.
Okay, thank you. And going back maybe to the previous question, we have a follow-up there. So what's the possibility of cobitolimod to become like a second-line treatment?
We see them as really good, as you saw, and I don't know if we've really been able to convey that. Only 16 to 18% of patients go into remission based on the currently approved drugs in an induction course of induction therapy, which means more than 80% of the patients are not in remission. So there is absolutely room for more drugs here because the patients will rotate through several classes. And if one doesn't work, you try the next one. And as I mentioned, there's more and more ideas that maybe you have to combine several of these drugs to really break through the inflammation. And that's where the safety of cobitolimod makes it an obvious candidate for that. And I forgot to mention, but we also recently announced that we are starting a pharmacokinetic study using the 500 milligram dose in patients with active ulcerative colitis to add to our previous PK data showing that cobitolimod is the systemic uptake of cobitolimod is very limited, which probably contributes to this great safety profile we have, whereas all the others are systemically administered immunosuppressants, and obviously you can get off-target effects from those, while ours is a local treatment. So we see very good prospects to position ourselves firmly before the TNF alphas and JAK inhibitors, and also before the other biologics, although they have a better safety profile than the TNF alphas and JAKs.
Yeah, thank you. And could you share any specific plans maybe on the clinical trial that could convey some confidence to investors that you will have a good enrollment despite the pandemic? And
well, so what we've seen is that Arena Pharmaceuticals and some others, Abevax, for example, that have been recruiting during the pandemic, have been able to maintain their timelines. So it's been possible to recruit patients. What we've seen is that it's been difficult to start new studies because sites have prioritized their ongoing studies and, of course, their normal care. But we see that is becoming less of an issue in many parts of the world. So we would expect, once we're up and running, that we will be able to have the same recruitment rates as others. And some other things speaking to our favor is that the big phase 3 programs have all completed their recruitment, and they're now in follow-up phases. So the remaining ones, mirikizumab and etrasimod and upadacitinib, they're all in their maintenance phase. So there should be more patients available to us than there has been the last couple of years, with several of these large phase 3 programs were completing their recruitment. And then again, as I mentioned, we have this model that we were very successful with in phase 2, really building a good team spirit, that it is an index-branded study with the potential to really help patients, and that can get the sites really excited to work with a smaller company and a very engaged company. And in our phase 2b study, we actually had the same recruitment rate as the big Pfizers and J&Js of this world. So we know we can be competitive on recruitment.
That sounds very encouraging. Thank you very much. And we